Few events have shaped modern democracy like the American Revolution. Here's how it happened. Before the United States existed, there was unrest, rebellion, and a fight for something bigger. Tensions had been building for years. After the 7 Years' War, Britain started taxing its American colonies to pay off debt. Acts like the Stamp Act and Tea Act weren't just economic issues. They struck at the colonists' belief in self-governance. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry, grounded in the idea that legitimate government needs consent. What set this revolution apart was its philosophical core. Inspired by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, leaders like Jefferson and Paine argued for natural rights and the idea that people could shape their own government. Despite facing a stronger, better-equipped British army, the colonists, under Washington's leadership and with crucial French support, managed to secure independence. By 1783, the United States had not only won a war, but launched a bold experiment in democracy that would influence generations to come. But before we dive back in, if you're enjoying what I'm doing here, leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I'd love to hear more about you. It's always fascinating to know whether you're using these episodes to fall asleep or to keep you company on a long drive. Alright, let's begin. It happened just before sunrise, on a damp spring morning in April of 1775. The sleepy stillness of Massachusetts was broken by a sudden crack, one single gunshot, fired in the small village of Lexington. No one can say for sure who pulled the trigger first. Some said it was the British, others insisted it was a colonial militiaman. But it didn't matter, not really. That one shot echoed far beyond the fields of New England. It would roll across oceans and decades, setting off a chain of events that would challenge one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. They called it the shot heard round the world. And in many ways, it was. It's strange to think how quiet revolutions begin. Not with parades or speeches, but with long simmering frustration, whispered plans behind tavern doors, and the quiet grip of a musket under candlelight. By the time blood was spilled at Lexington, something had already cracked beneath the surface. The war, they say, began there. But the story started long before that morning. Decades earlier, the British Empire had been at war elsewhere, far from American shores. The 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it was called in the colonies, had drained the crown's coffers. By 1763, Britain found itself victorious, but heavily in debt. The colonies, once a distant source of raw materials and trade, were suddenly seen through a new lens, as taxpayers. That shift would reshape everything. The British Parliament believed it was only fair. After all, the colonists had benefited from the war. The French threat to the West was now gone. Shouldn't the colonies help pay for their own defense? But the colonists didn't see it that way. They hadn't asked for war, nor for the British soldiers who now walked their streets. The first crack came with the Stamp Act of 1765. It was a simple law, on paper. Every printed document in the colonies, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards, now required a special stamp purchased from the Crown. To London, it was logical. To Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, it felt like a betrayal. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," wasn't just a slogan, it was a moral stance. These were British subjects, but they had no voice in Parliament. And suddenly, they were expected to pay, not just with money, but with obedience. The backlash was swift. Newspapers cried out, town halls buzzed with protest, and mobs tore down tax offices. In Virginia, Patrick Henry warned the House of Burgesses that Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and that George III might profit by their example. The tension was thick enough to taste. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act a year later, but the damage was done. The trust was gone, and in its place, a growing sense of resentment. More taxes followed, on glass, paint, tea, each one met with growing resistance. Protest became a way of life, and rebellion, slowly, began to feel not just possible, but inevitable. In Boston, tempers boiled faster than in most places. In 1770, British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of angry colonists, killing 5. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be called, was a turning point. Paul Revere's famous engraving, dramatic, exaggerated, spread across the colonies like wildfire. It didn't matter that the soldiers had likely fired in panic. The image told a cleaner story, that of red-coated villains, guns raised against the people they were meant to protect. And then there was the tea. In December of 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Mohawk warriors crept onto British ships docked in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the sea. It was a defiant, theatrical act, loud enough to make headlines in London and quiet enough to conceal identities. No one died that night, but it was one of the boldest gestures of resistance yet. The Crown responded with fury, imposing what became known as the Intolerable Acts, closing the harbour, revoking Massachusetts' charter, and sending more troops. These weren't just punishments, they were warnings. But instead of submission, they sparked unity. Across the colonies, once separate towns began to speak with a common voice. Letters travelled by horseback from Virginia to New Hampshire, and a fragile but growing alliance began to form. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. They called it the First Continental Congress. Some hoped for reconciliation. Others spoke of independence. Still a dangerous, even treasonous word. But by spring, the word wouldn't be whispered anymore. On the morning of April 19, 1775, British troops marched from Boston to seize weapons rumoured to be stockpiled in Concord. But they didn't get far before encountering colonial militia in Lexington. No one expected blood to be shed. Not yet. But the tension was unbearable. A shout, a shot, confusion, and suddenly, men were lying dead in the grass. The redcoats pressed on to Concord, but by then, hundreds of militiamen had gathered. They fired from behind stone walls, from forests and barns. British discipline clashed with colonial fury. The King's soldiers retreated under fire, all the way back to Boston, chased by the same people they had once considered subjects. It wasn't a full war yet, not officially, but the truth hung heavy in the smoke. There was no turning back. As night fell across the colonies, families whispered of what had happened. Some prayed, others packed. The countryside pulsed with movement. Men joining militias, towns preparing for siege, and newspapers setting type to report what had begun. In England, few understood how serious things had become. But in America, the air had changed. A line had been crossed. A fuse lit. And that's how revolutions often begin. Not with grand declarations, but with the crack of musket fire on a foggy morning. A shot that, in its mystery and consequence, shattered the illusion of peace and opened a door to something no one could fully imagine. It's a strange thing, really, how one morning in a quiet New England village could unravel the course of empire. But the world has always turned on moments like these. Fragile, fleeting, but deeply human. And now, across the 13 colonies, eyes turned to the British flag with something new behind them. Not fear, not loyalty, but resolve. The mood in the colonies shifted slowly at first, like the quiet gathering of clouds before a storm breaks. The early years of the 1760s saw growing tensions that were easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. Yet, for many colonists, the feeling was unmistakable. Something was changing beneath the surface of daily life, something that would pull them far from the comfort of British rule and into the uncertain path of rebellion. It all began with money, or more precisely, who controlled it. The British government, having spent heavily on wars in Europe and defending their vast empire, turned their eyes to the American colonies as a source of revenue. The Sugar Act of 1764 was an early attempt to tax goods like molasses and sugar imported into the colonies, but it was just the beginning. The Stamp Act of 1765 struck deeper. It mandated that many printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents, carry a tax stamp. This was not a small fee. It was a direct and unavoidable charge that touched nearly every colonist's life. Suddenly, everyday items felt like a toll paid to a distant government that had no voice for the people it taxed. What made these taxes so bitter was the principle behind them: no taxation without representation. The colonies had no representatives in the British Parliament. The laws and taxes came down from London, decided without any input from those who had to pay. It was a simple idea, but one that planted a seed of defiance that would grow rapidly. People began to see themselves not just as British subjects, but as a community with rights that even a king should respect. The reaction was swift and organized. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 brought together representatives from several colonies to coordinate opposition. Towns and cities saw protests, some turning violent, as mobs destroyed stamps and harassed tax collectors. One of the earliest and most striking examples of this anger came from groups like the Sons of Liberty. This shadowy assembly of craftsmen, merchants, and lawyers was led by figures who would become legendary, men such as Samuel Adams in Massachusetts. They met in taverns and back rooms, plotting not just protests, but a new identity for the colonies, one that was determined to resist control. Interestingly, not everyone was eager to rebel. Many colonists still felt a strong loyalty to the crown, believing that these taxes were temporary or justified by the protection Britain provided. But the debates were growing louder and more divisive. Newspapers churned out essays and pamphlets questioning authority and laying out new ideas of liberty and governance. One of the most influential voices was a pamphlet called The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, written by James Otis in 1764. He argued passionately that colonists had a right to be free from taxation imposed without their consent, a radical idea for the time. The turmoil reached a boiling point with the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. Britain thought the problem solved, but the damage had been done. New laws followed. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea. These renewed taxes reopened old wounds, and resistance flared again. What made this time different was the colonial response had become more organized and widespread. The concept of boycott, refusing to buy British goods, became a powerful tool. Women, often overlooked in history, played a vital role here. The Daughters of Liberty organized spinning bees to create homemade cloth, helping to reduce dependence on British imports. The resistance was becoming a shared effort, a communal act of rebellion. Boston, in particular, became the epicenter of unrest. The city was a bustling port, alive with merchants, sailors, and dock workers, all feeling the pinch of new taxes. The arrival of British troops in 1768 only added fuel to the fire. Their presence was meant to keep order, but instead brought tension and fear. The soldiers were outsiders, and their behavior sometimes sparked violent clashes with locals. One such incident, the Boston Massacre of 1770, saw British soldiers fire into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. The event was seized upon by colonial leaders and propagandists as a symbol of British tyranny, spreading anger far beyond Massachusetts. Amid these struggles, the Boston Tea Party stands out as a moment both dramatic and symbolic. In December 1773, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This was not just an act of protest against the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, but a statement of defiance. It showed that the colonists were willing to challenge the power of the Crown openly and creatively. The British government responded harshly with the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. These laws closed Boston Harbor, reduced the powers of self-government in Massachusetts, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried elsewhere. It was a direct assault on the freedoms the colonists had come to expect, and it pushed many who were once neutral or loyal into the revolutionary camp. Throughout this period, several key figures emerged as voices of resistance. John Adams, a lawyer from Massachusetts, used his skills in rhetoric and reason to argue for colonial rights and justice. Patrick Henry, in Virginia, gave fiery speeches that inspired many, famously declaring in 1775, "Give me liberty or give me death." These men, among others, helped shape the ideology that would soon underpin a revolution. It is fascinating to consider how much this movement was built on the power of ideas, on words and principles, rather than just force. The colonists were not merely fighting over money or taxes. They were fighting for a vision of how society should work. This intellectual awakening was influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who argued that governments existed by the consent of the governed, and that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property. What strikes me personally is how this conflict between empire and colony, between tradition and change, feels so deeply human. It's the story of people trying to find justice and voice under a system that seems deaf to their needs. The tension, the debates, the small acts of courage and rebellion, these paint a picture of a society on the brink of transformation. One might imagine the conversations in colonial homes, around candlelit tables, where families discussed news from afar with a mixture of hope and fear. The slow realization that a new future was possible, one not dictated by a distant monarch, but forged by the people themselves. The seeds of revolution were not sown overnight, but nurtured by years of frustration, protest, and growing unity. In all of this, it is important to remember that the road ahead was uncertain and perilous. The desire for freedom carried with it the weight of risk, loss, and sacrifice. Few knew where the path would lead, but the energy for change was undeniable, spreading from town to town, colony to colony, like a gentle but unstoppable tide. It's a reminder, perhaps, that history is often shaped not by sudden events alone, but by the slow burn of ideas and feelings. The American Revolution began long before muskets were fired. It started with a simple question of fairness, a challenge to authority, and the courage to imagine something different. As night deepens, we can almost hear the murmur of those early meetings, the clatter of stamped papers, the whispered calls for liberty, all moving steadily toward a moment when the colonies would no longer be content to ask politely but would demand their rights as a new nation. The tension that simmered quietly for months finally began to crackle with undeniable energy. After the First Continental Congress convened in 1774, bringing together representatives from 12 colonies, it became clear that the days of polite protest were nearing an end. This gathering was not just a meeting. It was the birth of collective resistance, an awakening of unity forged from shared frustration and hope. The delegates issued a Declaration of Rights, asserting their loyalty to the Crown, yet demanding the repeal of the intolerable acts, those punitive laws imposed after the Boston Tea Party. It was a delicate balance, trying to stand firm against what they perceived as injustice, without immediately severing ties. But the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of urgency, one that no calm letter or petition could soothe. Militia groups made up of ordinary farmers, tradesmen, and townsfolk began training in secret. They weren't professional soldiers, but they were fiercely committed, ready to defend their homes and liberties. These militias, often called Minutemen, prided themselves on being ready to assemble at a minute's notice. The very phrase captures a sense of readiness, a heartbeat quickening with anticipation. One evening in April 1775, whispers filled the air across towns and villages near Boston. The British regulars planned a march to Concord, aiming to seize a stockpile of weapons hidden by the colonial militias. The colonists knew they had to act. The night's silence was punctuated by urgent riders, weaving through the dark with news blazing ahead. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, names now etched into legend, sped along on horseback, their calls echoing through the empty streets. The British are coming! Imagine the quiet dawn breaking, with dew still clinging to the grass and the air cool but alive with tension. At Lexington Green, the confrontation unfolded. Around 70 colonial militiamen stood facing the British troops. Accounts tell us no one knows who fired the very first shot, the shot heard round the world, but its impact was immediate. The peace shattered, the war began. The British fired volleys, and the colonists scattered, some wounded, some fallen. Yet the rebels regrouped and engaged the soldiers again at Concord's North Bridge. There, they drove the British back in a volley of determined musket fire. It was a small victory, but a significant one. The retreat of British forces back to Boston turned into a harrowing journey. Ambushed by hundreds of militiamen firing from behind trees and stone walls, the troops faced a relentless, invisible enemy. It was the first taste of a new kind of warfare, irregular, passionate, personal. The British had underestimated the colony's resolve and the power of their own citizens willing to rise in defense. Reflecting on this, one can sense the mixture of fear, excitement, and disbelief among both sides. For the colonists, it was a moment of awakening, the realization that their grievances could no longer be voiced in calm diplomacy. For the British, it was a shock that the rebellion had taken a violent, irreversible turn. One soldier wrote in his journal about the chaos and confusion, describing the Americans as invisible ghosts, striking swiftly and melting away. But what led these people, once loyal subjects, to pick up arms against their king? The story reaches far beyond taxes or laws. It was about identity, about a growing belief that their rights as Englishmen were being trampled, that distant lawmakers had forgotten the people they governed. The Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed direct taxes on printed materials, was seen not just as unfair, but as a breach of the sacred principle that no taxation should occur without representation. Then the Townshend Acts in 1767 deepened the divide, taxing everyday items like glass, paint, and tea, igniting protests and boycotts. Tea, a simple yet symbolic commodity, became a lightning rod for colonial defiance. The Boston Tea Party in December 1773 was more than a dramatic act of protest. It was a statement that the colonists would not be mere subjects, passively accepting laws passed thousands of miles away. Disguised as Native Americans, men boarded British ships and dumped their precious cargo into Boston Harbor, turning tea into a powerful symbol of resistance. The British response was swift and harsh, introducing the coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor, dissolved the Massachusetts government, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England. The aim was to isolate and punish Massachusetts, but instead it united the colonies in outrage. The colonies realized that what happened to Boston could happen anywhere. Personal stories from this period reveal the human side of these seismic events. Abigail Adams, writing to her husband John, urged him to remember the ladies in the new society they hoped to build. She worried that the revolution might overlook women's roles and rights, a reminder that even amidst the grand political upheaval, individual hopes and fears shaped the future. In the taverns and town squares, ordinary people debated, planned, and dreamed of freedom. As tensions escalated, leaders emerged from the shadows. Samuel Adams, with his fiery speeches and organizational skill, stoked the flames of rebellion. Patrick Henry's famous words in 1775, "Give me liberty or give me death," captured the raw emotion behind the movement. These voices gave shape to the chaos, turning scattered grievances into a shared vision. Yet, the line between protest and war was not clearly drawn. In some places, loyalists, colonists still faithful to the crown, clashed with revolutionaries, sometimes violently. Families and communities found themselves divided, neighbours wary of each other. The revolution was not just a battle between Britain and the colonies. It was a civil conflict that tore at the fabric of society. By the spring of 1775, it was clear the conflict would not be contained. Militia mobilizations increased, British troops fortified Boston, and the uneasy peace shattered. The Continental Congress authorized the formation of a Continental Army, appointing George Washington as its commander. His calm determination and leadership would become the backbone of the American cause. Washington himself was acutely aware of the immense challenges ahead. In a letter to a friend, he wrote about the grievous task of molding an untrained, ragged militia into a disciplined force capable of standing against the British Army. Yet, despite the odds, there was a quiet confidence, an understanding that this was more than a military struggle. It was a fight for a new idea, a new way of life. This period of transition, from peaceful protest to armed resistance, marks a fascinating moment in history. The personal courage, the shifting loyalties, and the mounting uncertainty all weave together like threads in a complex tapestry. It was a time when ordinary people were called to extraordinary action, when the air itself seemed charged with possibility and danger. Listening to these stories late at night, one can almost feel the weight of muskets, the distant echoes of drum beats, and the whispered conversations by candlelight. It reminds us that history is not just dates and battles. It is the lives, hopes, and fears of real people, facing a future they could scarcely imagine. As the summer of 1776 unfolded, the atmosphere in Philadelphia thickened with a quiet tension that felt almost tangible. The delegates of the Second Continental Congress, gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, wrestled with an idea that once seemed impossible, declaring the 13 colonies independent from the British Crown. The room buzzed with debate, uncertainty, and cautious hope, each voice carrying the weight of lives and futures not yet written. Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian lawyer known for his eloquence and thoughtful mind, was chosen to draft a document that would capture the collective yearning of a people for freedom. What emerged was the Declaration of Independence, words that would ripple across the world, proclaiming not just a political break, but a profound assertion of human rights, and the belief that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. Jefferson's phrasing, such as all men are created equal, resonated deeply, though the full meaning and application of those words would unfold slowly, unevenly, and with many contradictions. It was a summer marked by urgency. The colonies, no longer merely protesting taxation without representation, were stepping into uncharted territory. The formal act of rebellion required not just courage, but a vision of a future built on principles rather than monarchs. While many delegates feared the consequences of open defiance, the stirring pamphlet by Thomas Paine, titled Common Sense, had already begun to change public opinion. Paine's clear, accessible arguments cut through doubts and fears, speaking directly to common people, urging them to see independence not as a distant dream, but as a necessity. The global impact of this declaration was profound. It sent shockwaves through the British Empire and intrigued monarchs and revolutionaries alike. Here was a colony claiming the right to self-determination, inspired by Enlightenment ideals that challenged centuries of royal authority. The declaration was a bold statement of intent, a public manifesto that risked everything. While the Congress debated and the document took shape, the realities of war pressed closer. The Continental Army, still fragile and poorly supplied, faced the formidable task of holding territory and winning hearts. George Washington, appointed commander-in-chief months earlier, bore the heavy responsibility of turning this fragile coalition of militias into an effective fighting force. Washington's leadership was marked by steadfastness and an almost paternal concern for his men. The letters he wrote during this period reveal a man weighed down by the immense burden of command, but never losing hope. Across the colonies, the decision to declare independence ignited new waves of commitment and resistance. Militias formed with renewed vigor, towns raised funds and supplies, and families whispered prayers for the men who marched away to fight for a cause they barely understood, but deeply believed in. The Declaration was more than just words on parchment. It became a symbol of a collective dream, fragile and fierce. Yet, even as the birth of a nation was declared, the reality on the ground was often harsh. The war was not an immediate path to glory, but a grueling test of endurance. British forces, confident and well-trained, sought to crush the rebellion quickly. Early battles were often costly for the Americans, exposing the gaps in training and supplies. But beneath these setbacks simmered a growing sense of unity, a belief that freedom was worth every sacrifice. It's easy to romanticize the moment of declaring independence as a singular act of heroism, but in truth, it was the culmination of years of frustration, courage, and quiet determination. The delegates knew that signing this declaration was almost a death sentence if the rebellion failed. John Adams, one of the most vocal advocates for independence, later reflected on the courage it took. "There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations," he wrote, "and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us." This period also brought forward remarkable voices and stories that reveal the complexity of the revolution. Many ordinary people, often overlooked by history, found themselves swept into the tides of change. Women like Abigail Adams, who wrote to her husband John Adams urging him to remember the ladies, advocated for a vision of liberty that extended beyond men. Free African Americans and enslaved people began to consider what independence might mean for their futures, sometimes joining the fight with hope and sometimes with despair. The Declaration itself was a statement as much about ideals as about practical politics. It was a beginning, a promise that the colonies would strive to create a society based on rights and justice. Though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with contradictions, it posed questions that would haunt the young nation for centuries. Questions about who truly counted as equal, who would wield power, and what freedom would look like in daily life. Reflecting on this moment, One cannot help but sense the quiet bravery it took to sign that document, to stand for something so radical in a world still ruled by kings and empires. The summer heat in Philadelphia may have been oppressive, but the spirit within that room burned brighter, fueled by hope and the unyielding human desire for self-determination. In the days that followed the Declaration, the colonies faced the immense challenge of transforming words into action. The Continental Army prepared to confront the British military, but they also had to navigate internal divisions, resource shortages, and the daily realities of war. The war was no longer a distant concept. It was a harsh, unfolding reality that demanded sacrifice and resilience. Some historians note that the Declaration of Independence was also a diplomatic move, designed to garner support from foreign nations like France and Spain. It was an announcement to the world, a way to legitimize the rebellion and appeal for allies in a struggle that now seemed unstoppable. As summer gave way to fall, the war crept into the hearts and homes of countless families. The ideals proclaimed in Philadelphia began to echo across battlefields, taverns, and farms, shaping a new identity. Though the Declaration was debated and revised over several tense days, it was on July 4th, 1776, that the Continental Congress formally adopted the final version. The date would later become a symbol of independence, but at the time, it passed with little ceremony. No parades or fireworks, just a quiet but momentous vote in a warm room. In the years to come, the 4th of July would be remembered not for the ink or signatures, but for the courage it took to claim a new destiny in the face of a powerful empire. America was no longer just a collection of colonies. It was a fledgling nation, fragile yet full of promise, holding on to the fragile dream of liberty amid the uncertainties of war. The early months of the war weighed heavily on George Washington and the fledgling Continental Army. As 1776 gave way to 1777, the hope that swift victories might secure independence began to fade beneath the relentless march of hardship. The British Army, better equipped and trained, had pushed the Americans out of New York City after a series of crushing defeats. The ragtag troops, many poorly clothed and poorly fed, struggled to maintain morale in the face of such overwhelming odds. One of the most defining chapters of this dark period was the brutal winter at Valley Forge. From December 1777 to June 1778, the Continental Army huddled through bitter cold and scarcity on the outskirts of Philadelphia. It is often remembered as a symbol of endurance, a crucible in which the American spirit was tested and tempered. Yet the reality was far grimmer than simple heroic narratives suggest. Frostbite, disease, and starvation stalked the encampment like unseen spectres. Nearly 2,500 soldiers died that winter, more from hunger and illness than battle wounds. Washington's leadership was both a beacon and a burden. He spent long days and sleepless nights coordinating supplies, encouraging his men, and seeking support from the Continental Congress. His resolve never wavered, but he was painfully aware of the fragility of the cause. In letters to friends and allies, Washington expressed a mixture of frustration and hope. He wrote, "The hardships we endure now will be the foundation of a free nation." That quiet determination helped hold the army together when it might have otherwise dissolved into despair. Amidst the suffering, a transformation was underway. The arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer, proved pivotal. Von Steuben brought much-needed discipline and training, teaching the troops European-style drills and camp hygiene. His efforts reshaped the army into a more effective fighting force. What began as a collection of farmers and tradesmen slowly evolved into a professional military, capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British. Washington also recognized the need for unconventional strategies. Conventional European-style battles favored the British, whose numbers and firepower dwarfed the Americans. So, guerrilla tactics became vital. Small bands of militiamen used their intimate knowledge of the land to ambush supply lines, disrupt communications, and harass enemy patrols. The war was as much about endurance and attrition as it was about grand battles. This flexible, adaptive approach helped keep the revolutionary cause alive when traditional tactics failed. One can almost imagine the quiet desperation mingled with stubborn hope around campfires in the wilderness. Soldiers trading stories of home, dreams of freedom, and the weight of sacrifice. They knew the road ahead was long and uncertain, but every weary footstep marked a step towards something new, something unknown. The American people themselves played an indispensable role in this period of darkness. Civilians, often overlooked in grand histories of battle, provided crucial support. Women managed farms and businesses, cared for the wounded, and even participated directly in the conflict by disguising themselves as men to fight. The famous story of Molly Pitcher, who brought water to thirsty soldiers and took her husband's place at a cannon during the Battle of Monmouth, exemplifies this quiet courage. African Americans also found themselves caught in the shifting tides of war. While many were promised freedom in exchange for fighting, the reality was complex and uneven. Some joined the Continental Army, others fought for the British, who offered emancipation to slaves willing to take up arms. These choices highlighted the paradox at the heart of the Revolution, a fight for liberty, shadowed by the persistence of slavery. The social fabric of the colonies was stretched and strained in these years. Loyalties divided families and communities. The so-called Loyalists, or Tories, remained faithful to the crown, often facing persecution and exile. The Patriots, on the other hand, were forging a new identity based on ideas of self-governance and natural rights. This internal struggle created a kind of civil war within the broader conflict, adding layers of complexity to the narrative. In conversations recorded decades later, descendants of soldiers and civilians recalled the fear and uncertainty of those times with a kind of reverent quiet. One family memoir spoke of a mother who hid her son's musket in the attic, terrified of British patrols but proud of his commitment. Such personal stories remind us that history is not only the domain of generals and politicians, but of ordinary people whose small acts of bravery shaped the course of nations. By mid-1778, signs of resilience began to emerge more clearly. The army's survival through Valley Forge became a testament to endurance and unity. Though far from victory, the Revolution had passed one of its greatest trials. Washington's ability to inspire loyalty and his willingness to adapt tactics underscored the uniquely American blend of determination and pragmatism. In reflecting on these struggles, I find it striking how much the success of the Revolution hinged on human qualities rarely captured in textbooks. The steady hope in the face of despair, the quiet acts of kindness amid chaos, the stubborn refusal to give in. These are the threads that weave through the fabric of history, often hidden beneath the grand dates and battles, but essential all the same. It's tempting to imagine the harsh winter at Valley Forge simply as a backdrop for heroic endurance, but it was also a moment of profound transformation. The army that emerged was not just better trained, it was bound together by shared sacrifice, a collective resolve that whispered promises of freedom and self-determination. In many ways, this period forged the character of the new nation as much as any battlefield victory. Listening to the voices of those who lived through it, we can sense both their exhaustion and their fierce commitment. One soldier wrote, "We have suffered much, yet our hearts remain unbroken." That balance of vulnerability and strength seems to capture the spirit of the American Revolution itself. These darker days, difficult as they were, remind us that history is rarely a straightforward march to victory. It is a winding path shaped by struggle, endurance, and the small, persistent sparks of hope. As we continue to explore this story, it becomes clear how those sparks would soon catch fire in unexpected ways, altering the course of history and the fate of a continent. The victory at Saratoga in 1777 was more than just a battlefield triumph. It was a pivotal moment that transformed the American Revolution from a desperate colonial uprising into a war of global consequence. Before this, the Continental Army had been struggling. Scarce supplies, wavering morale, and a powerful British military seemingly invincible. But the capture of General John Burgoyne's forces in upstate New York not only halted a major British offensive, but also ignited a beacon of hope among the American revolutionaries and their sympathizers abroad. Benjamin Franklin, who had been tirelessly lobbying in Paris in 1776, seized this opportunity. His charm, wit, and deep understanding of European politics opened doors that had previously been closed. It wasn't merely about seeking aid. Franklin understood that America's cause had to be framed within the larger rivalries of European powers. France, still nursing wounds from its loss to Britain in the 7 Years' War less than 2 decades prior, saw the American rebellion as a chance to weaken its old enemy. By early 1778, this delicate dance of diplomacy bore fruit. The Treaty of Alliance was signed, binding France and the American colonies in a military partnership. France promised soldiers, a powerful navy, and vital supplies that the fledgling Continental Army so desperately needed. The arrival of French ships in American harbors was more than military support. It was a psychological boost. Suddenly, the revolution felt less like a doomed gamble and more like a legitimate global struggle for independence. Yet, the infusion of foreign aid brought new challenges. The logistics of coordinating armies across an ocean were formidable. Language barriers, cultural differences, and clashing command styles tested the patience of both sides. Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman inspired by the ideals of liberty, became a trusted bridge between the Americans and their French allies. His enthusiasm was infectious, and his presence symbolized the transatlantic nature of the fight for freedom. The French Navy's role cannot be overstated. Control of the seas was essential to both supply lines and military strategy. British naval dominance had long been assumed, but now French fleets challenged this supremacy. Their presence forced the British to divert resources and reconsider their strategies. Naval battles, often overlooked in popular recountings, were vital in shaping the war's outcome. Money, too, flowed with the French alliance. The Continental Congress, chronically short of funds, welcomed French loans and grants that helped pay soldiers and buy arms. This financial lifeline allowed the revolutionaries to sustain their fight during some of the darkest days. However, the reliance on foreign aid came with the weight of expectation. France wanted to see tangible results, and American leaders felt the pressure to prove that their cause was worthy. The impact of the French alliance rippled beyond just France. Spain, motivated by its own conflicts with Britain, and the Dutch Republic, wary of British power, also lent support, turning what began as a colonial rebellion into a complex global war. Battles were fought not only on American soil but in the Caribbean, Europe, and even India. This broader scope stretched British resources thin and altered the strategic landscape entirely. Amid these grand movements, the daily realities of war continued to unfold. The Continental Army, newly bolstered but still facing shortages, relied heavily on guerrilla tactics and local militia support. The French troops brought experience and discipline, but the revolutionaries' intimate knowledge of the land and fierce resolve were equally crucial. This mix of formal military alliance and irregular warfare kept the British off balance. Personal letters from soldiers and commanders of the time reveal a mixture of hope and exhaustion. One French officer wrote home in 1778, "The Americans fight not only with muskets but with the fire of their hearts, and that flame is difficult to extinguish." Washington, who had often expressed frustration at the army's lack of supplies and training, found renewed strength in the presence of French allies. His correspondence shows a cautious optimism, tempered by the grim realities that remained. The alliance also inspired a cultural exchange. French ideas about liberty and governance mingled with American revolutionary ideals, influencing the emerging nation's identity. Yet, this was no perfect partnership. Differences in priorities and misunderstandings surfaced. France was wary of committing too deeply, mindful of its own fragile finances and political situation. For the Americans, dependence on a foreign power was a complicated necessity, stirring debates about sovereignty and future relations. While the alliance was a turning point, the road ahead was far from smooth. The British were determined to regain control and struck back fiercely, especially in the southern colonies. But the arrival of French troops in naval power made British victories more costly and less decisive. The revolution had truly become a global contest, and the balance was shifting. It's fascinating to think about how this partnership, born of pragmatism and shared enemies, ultimately shaped the birth of the United States. Without French support, the revolution might have faltered or taken a very different course. The intertwined fates of these nations remind us that history is rarely the story of a single people or event, but a tapestry woven from many threads. Reflecting on this, I often wonder how different things might have been if the French had hesitated, or if Burgoyne's campaign had succeeded. Would the dream of independence have survived, or would it have been crushed beneath the weight of a global empire? These are the quiet what-ifs that linger, like soft echoes in the night, urging us to listen more closely to the subtleties beneath the thunder of cannon fire. The French alliance transformed the revolution from isolated rebellion into an international movement, underscoring that freedom, once kindled, can inspire far beyond its origin. The delicate dance of diplomacy, military aid, and shared ideals during these years reminds us that history is not only written on battlefields, but also in drawing rooms and ambassadorial chambers. As the war moved forward, the combined efforts of Americans and their French allies would pave the way for crucial victories and eventual independence. The story of this alliance is a testament to resilience, friendship, and the unexpected alliances forged in the pursuit of a common dream. And in that, there is something quietly beautiful, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can find a way, carried on the tides of distant seas. The war was never just fought on open fields with muskets cracking in neat lines under powdered wigs. No, much of it unfolded behind closed doors, in darkened parlours, among whispered conversations and coded letters. If you listen carefully to the silences in the official histories, you can almost hear it, the low hum of a different kind of warfare, one carried not with gunpowder, but with secrecy, deception, and nerves of steel. There was a war within the war, and it was everywhere. In the tidewater towns of Virginia, in the narrow streets of occupied New York, in quiet farmhouses where loyalty divided families, the revolution twisted into something messier and more personal. And for some, it was less about the crown versus the colonies, and more about neighbour versus neighbour, brother against brother. These weren't just political disagreements. These were choices that shaped the survival of communities, and in many cases, of individuals. One of the most quietly fascinating stories is that of the Culper Ring, a web of spies operating under the noses of the British in New York. George Washington, often painted as a stoic general standing tall on the battlefield, was in fact deeply invested in espionage. He called intelligence the surest means of success, and he meant it. The Culper Ring came into being around 1778, coordinated under Washington's order and managed by Major Benjamin Tormage, who went by the alias John Bolton. It's funny how you can walk down a quiet Long Island road today and not know that someone once passed secret notes under a tree in that very spot. The ring was subtle, careful. They used codes, invisible ink, and a method known as the dead drop, where messages were hidden in places like hollow trees or buried under a stone fence post. Abraham Woodhull, using the codename Samuel Culper, was a key player. He would gather information from British-occupied New York and pass it through a network that included a tavern keeper, a courier on horseback, and even a female operative. Historians now believe may have been Anna Strong, who used laundry on a clothesline to signal messages. A black petticoat here, a handkerchief there. It's poetic in a way, how such ordinary gestures could conceal revolutionary secrets. And these weren't just little side missions. The intelligence from the Culper Ring helped uncover a planned betrayal by none other than Benedict Arnold, who had secretly agreed to hand over the fort at West Point to the British in 1780. Arnold's name still stings in American memory, but his story, like so many from this war, is layered. He had fought bravely for the Americans, been wounded in battle, and felt overlooked, insulted, and impoverished by the very cause he had once bled for. Betrayal, in his case, came from a place of bitterness and ego, as much as ideology. Arnold's co-conspirator, Major John Andre, was captured in civilian clothes, behind American lines, carrying incriminating papers in his boot. When the papers were delivered to Washington, there was no room for mercy. Andre, though charming and well-liked even by his enemies, was hanged as a spy on October 2nd, 1780. His fate became a kind of ghost story told in both camps, a reminder that not all deaths in this war came from a musket ball. But espionage wasn't the only shadow cast over the revolution. Across the 13 colonies, communities were often bitterly divided between patriots and loyalists. This wasn't a clean split. In towns and cities, on farms and plantations, loyalties crossed bloodlines. Brothers fought on opposite sides. Ministers preached revolution while their congregants whispered prayers for the king. Some families changed allegiances more than once, just to survive. One chilling example comes from the Carolinas, where the war took on the flavor of a civil conflict. Loyalist militias clashed with patriot forces in brutal skirmishes, often without the formalities of surrender or mercy. At the Battle of King's Mountain in 1780, patriot militia surrounded and overwhelmed the Loyalist force, most of them American-born colonists themselves. The fighting was savage and personal, with the patriots refusing to give quarter, a stark contrast to the often romanticized image of noble 18th century warfare. And then there were the many who weren't given much of a choice at all. Native American tribes were pulled into the conflict, often used as pawns in British or American strategies. The Iroquois Confederacy split over the war, with some nations siding with the British and others with the Americans. The resulting internal strife left scars that would last generations. The revolution for them wasn't a pathway to liberty. It was often a prelude to land loss, displacement, and betrayal. African Americans too were caught in a cruel paradox. The language of freedom filled the air, yet most of them remained enslaved. Some found hope in the British promise of liberty in exchange for service. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had issued a proclamation in 1775, offering freedom to any enslaved person who escaped and joined the British forces. Thousands did, risking everything for the chance at something better. Others fought for the Patriots, some willingly, some under pressure. Even after the war, many of these promises, from both sides, went unfulfilled. Women, too, played roles far beyond what most textbooks admit. They acted as couriers, spies, fundraisers, and in rare cases, even soldiers in disguise. Deborah Sampson famously disguised herself as a man and fought in the Continental Army. Her story came to light after she was honorably discharged, her bravery acknowledged by Washington himself. And then there were the countless women who kept farms running, raised children alone, and endured military occupation while their husbands fought or died. Their quiet resilience was a backbone of the revolution. I always find myself thinking about how many lives this war touched that never made it into the big books. The mothers who buried sons on both sides, the freedmen who lived in hope and died in chains, the young courier who galloped through a rainstorm with a message in his boot, never knowing whether he'd live to deliver it. They were all part of this story, even if history didn't carve their names in marble. This was a war of battles, yes, but it was also a war of secrets. And in those secrets, you find a deeper truth about what it means to fight for something, to believe in a cause, even when the lines blur and the cost is everything. Cornwallis believed he was safe. In the humid Virginia summer of 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis stationed his troops at Yorktown, a sleepy port town nestled between the York and James rivers. He had entrenched his forces, fortified his position, and trusted that the powerful British Navy would be able to resupply or extract him if needed. After years of brutal back-and-forth campaigns across the colonies, he was hoping to strike a final blow, or at least hold the line until reinforcements arrived. But in the shadow of these hopes, a trap was quietly forming. General George Washington, who had long kept his army near New York, saw an opportunity. The French, now fully committed allies, had brought not only money and muskets, but ships. And ships would be key. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was already sailing up from the Caribbean, heading toward the Chesapeake Bay. If they could block the sea, and if Washington could march south quickly enough, they could close the jaws of a trap that Cornwallis wouldn't escape. It was a risky plan. Washington had spent much of the war dancing around larger British forces, playing a game of delay and survival. But now, with the enemy exposed and a powerful ally in position, the time had come to strike. He began the long march south, coordinating with French General Rochambeau, who led several thousand well-trained troops. Together, they moved swiftly, nearly 500 miles in under 6 weeks. It was a logistical feat. Men, horses, cannon, supplies, all coordinated with precision. Meanwhile, de Grasse arrived just in time to chase off a British fleet sent to rescue Cornwallis. The bay was sealed. By late September, the trap had closed. Over 17,000 Allied troops surrounded Yorktown. Inside the British lines, Cornwallis had about 8,000 men, many sick or weakened. For days, the Americans and French dug trenches, set up artillery, and began a relentless bombardment. Night and day, the sky above Yorktown flashed and thundered with cannon fire. In his letters, Washington seemed almost overcome with anticipation. He had waited so long for a moment like this, not just for revenge or pride, but for the possibility of ending a war that had stretched over 6 long, bitter years. One French officer, the Marquis de Barbé-Marbois, described the scene. The ground shook beneath our feet as our batteries opened fire. The British fired back with desperation, but we were stronger, more focused. We could sense it. The end was coming. On October 14th, American and French forces launched a bold nighttime assault on 2 key British redoubts, defensive outposts guarding the heart of Cornwallis's lines. The attacks were brutal and swift. Alexander Hamilton, then a young officer under Washington, led one of the charges. He later recalled the moment as madness lit by courage, the kind of close-quarters chaos where men fought with bayonets and bare hands in the darkness. By morning, the redoubts were taken. The British lines were cracking. Inside Yorktown, morale collapsed. Just 4 days later, on October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered. The image of that moment has become part of American legend. British soldiers stacking their arms in neat rows, drums playing a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." But Cornwallis himself didn't attend. He claimed illness and sent his second-in-command to present the surrender. For Washington, it was a vindication. Years of hardship, of impossible decisions, of leading a ragtag army through winters and defeats. All of it had led here.
But the war didn't end that day.
News travelled slowly. It would take months for word of Yorktown to reach King George III in London. And even then, the British were reluctant to admit defeat. Skirmishes and minor battles continued into 1782, but something fundamental had shifted. Parliament began to question the war's cost. Public support collapsed. The colonies, it seemed, were not coming back. And so the long, delicate process of peace began. But that, perhaps, is a story for another night. For now, let's stay in the quiet aftermath of Yorktown, where the guns have fallen silent and the smoke clears gently over the fields. In the soft rustle of the Chesapeake breeze, one can almost hear the echo of distant footsteps, not of marching soldiers, but of a nation beginning to rise from the ruins of war, uncertain and untested, but free. There's something haunting about that moment. All the violence, the politics, the betrayals and hopes, they converge here, in a small town that might otherwise have been forgotten. But Yorktown became something more, a symbol of what was possible when perseverance met opportunity. It's strange to think how much of history turns on such fragile balances. A delayed ship, a misjudged order, a single wrong turn. And yet, through all of it, the American experiment survived, not by certainty or divine right, but by the grit of men and women who, despite their flaws, believed in something better. It makes you wonder, how close did it come to slipping away? But on that warm October day, as surrender flags fluttered in the breeze, and the war's final echoes faded into the earth, the answer didn't matter. The dream had held. The war had been won on the battlefield, but true peace, the kind etched into treaties and maps, takes longer to shape. After the surrender at Yorktown in October 1781, the world didn't suddenly fall quiet. There were still scattered British troops occupying cities like New York, Charleston and Savannah. Skirmishes flared, tempers remained high. But for the first time in years, hope was not just a dream, it was a destination. In Europe, the victory at Yorktown sent ripples through palaces and parliaments. The British government, already weary from years of fighting, faced intense political pressure. In February 1782, Parliament voted to discontinue offensive operations in America. Lord North, the British Prime Minister who had overseen much of the war effort, resigned. One of his opponents described it as a sigh of relief echoing across the Channel. Still, a treaty would not right itself. For the American delegation, the task was immense: to sit across from one of the most powerful empires on earth and define, in ink, the boundaries of a new nation. The peace negotiations began in Paris. There, in smoky drawing rooms and over whispered dinners, a team of American negotiators gathered. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. Each had a unique style. Franklin, now a living symbol of the revolution in Europe, played the part of the charming elder statesman. Adams, sharp and principled, often clashed with others, but was deeply respected. And Jay, quiet and steady, understood how to navigate the unspoken language of diplomacy. One of the first challenges was unity. The Americans had allied with France and Spain, but each nation had its own goals. France, for example, wasn't too keen on a powerful, independent America stretching westward. Spain wanted control of Gibraltar and had designs on American territory. The Americans realized they couldn't simply follow their allies' lead. They had to represent their own interests, directly. Against instructions from the Continental Congress to consult with France on every decision, they began to negotiate independently with Britain. It was a controversial move, but as John Jay later wrote, we must act not as colonies, but as equals. The negotiations dragged on through 1782. At stake were not just borders, but fishing rights, debts, and the fate of loyalists who had remained faithful to the crown. The Americans demanded recognition of their independence, not just in name, but in full sovereignty. They pushed for expansive boundaries, reaching west to the Mississippi River. The British, surprisingly, agreed. They were more concerned with checking French influence than punishing their former colonies. On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. It remains one of the most quietly powerful documents in modern history. The preamble begins, "In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity," a reminder of how diplomacy in the 18th century was still wrapped in the language of divine right. But then come the terms, clear, bold, and final. Great Britain acknowledged the United States as free, sovereign, and independent. Boundaries were set. The Mississippi would mark the western edge. Americans would retain fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. Congress promised to recommend fair treatment of loyalists and repayment of debts owed to British creditors. There were still shadows behind the signatures. Many loyalists lost everything. Some fled to Canada or returned to Britain. Native tribes, who had not been consulted, saw their land signed away without their consent. Enslaved people who had fought for the British were left in limbo. Some were evacuated to Nova Scotia or the Caribbean, others simply abandoned. But for most Americans, the treaty was cause for celebration. Church bells rang, towns held parades. In Boston, a crowd carried an effigy of King George through the streets, only to stop and quietly burn it beneath the old Liberty Tree. Still, beneath the joy was uncertainty. The colonies, once bound together by rebellion, now had to figure out how to live together, how to govern, trade, and decide who they really were. In March 1781, even before Yorktown, the Articles of Confederation had taken effect. It was America's first national government, a loose alliance of states held together by a fragile Congress. Under the Articles, there was no president, no national court, and no real power to tax. Each state retained sovereignty and independence. It was idealistic, born of a desire to avoid tyranny, but it left the new nation weak. States quarreled over borders, currency, and trade. Soldiers went unpaid. Foreign nations, unsure of the American experiment, hesitated to offer loans or treaties. George Washington, who had retired to Mount Vernon after the war, watched with quiet concern. In a letter to James Madison, he warned, "We are fast verging to anarchy and confusion." The young republic was not yet stable. It was something more delicate, an idea still finding its legs. And yet, the memory of unity lingered. The long march from Boston to Yorktown, the shared hunger, fear, and fire, those things did not fade. In Philadelphia, just a few years later, a new gathering would meet to build something stronger, the Constitutional Convention. But in 1783, as the ink dried in Paris, that future was still unwritten. I sometimes think about the silence that must have settled over those 13 states in the fall of that year. After so many cannon blasts, so many drums and marches and midnight rides, there must have been moments where the quiet felt strange, the kind of stillness that only follows great storms. In New York, the last British troops would not leave until November 1783. That day, Evacuation Day, was marked with celebration and relief. Washington himself marched into the city, greeted by crowds. A young Alexander Hamilton, now an aide-de-camp no more, stood with pride as the Union Jack was lowered, and the stars and stripes raised. Later, at France's Tavern in Manhattan, Washington gathered his officers and gave a farewell speech. One witness recalled how his voice trembled with emotion. "With a heart full of love and gratitude," he said, "I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." Then, without pomp or pageantry, he left. That moment, simple and quiet, marked the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Some stories are too often polished smooth by the telling, worn down into neat edges and familiar rhythms. The American Revolution, for many, has become just that. A tidy story of noble farmers with flintlocks, marching resolutely against tyranny, led by powdered gentlemen reciting stirring words about liberty. But the real history, the one hidden behind the textbook gloss, is far more tangled and far more human. Let's begin with a simple image. A boy, maybe 14 years old, barefoot in the mud outside Charleston. His family supports the Patriots, but his neighbors do not. When British troops arrive, they don't ask for loyalty, they demand it. That boy, according to records, was taken prisoner and held on a prison ship, where hundreds of men and boys died of disease and starvation. His name was Andrew Jackson. He would go on to become the 7th President of the United States. But first, he carried the scars, literal ones, from a British officer's sword after refusing to shine the man's boots. It's stories like his that remind us the revolution wasn't just strategy and statecraft. It was also personal, violent, ugly, and sometimes contradictory. Take the famous tale of Paul Revere's ride. It lives in legend thanks to Longfellow's poem, "One if by land, two if by sea." But Revere wasn't riding alone. There were others that night, like William Dawes and Dr. Samuel Prescott. Dawes actually took a different route to warn the militia. Prescott was the only one who made it to Concord. Revere? He was captured before finishing the ride. The myth is clean. The truth is complicated. Then there's the cherry tree. George Washington and his fabled honesty. "I cannot tell a lie," he supposedly said. But that story was invented by a biographer named Mason Locke Weems, writing years after Washington's death, trying to shape the man into a kind of moral statue. The real Washington was certainly admirable, but also a deeply pragmatic general who could be ruthless when he had to be. He ordered spies hanged, allowed for the flogging of deserters, and, yes, enslaved more than 100 people at Mount Vernon. That's a truth we must sit with. The man who helped birth a nation of liberty held others in chains. And this brings us to one of the most painful paradoxes of the revolution, the role of slavery. At the very moment men were penning phrases like, "All men are created equal," they were doing so while owning human beings. Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, enslaved over 600 people in his lifetime. Even as he wrote eloquently against tyranny, he profited from it. One of the people he enslaved was Sally Hemings, a woman who bore him several children. Their relationship, if we can call it that, given the power imbalance, is a haunting reminder that America's birth was not clean. And yet, many African Americans fought in the Revolution, on both sides. Some, like Peter Salem, fought for the Patriots. Others joined the British, lured by promises of freedom. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, offered emancipation to any enslaved man who would fight for the crown. Thousands took him up on it. These black loyalists, as they came to be known, were eventually evacuated by the British at the war's end. Some resettled in Canada, others in Sierra Leone. Their names rarely appear in school books, but their lives were no less revolutionary. We also forget how internally divided the colonies were. The war wasn't just between redcoats and rebels, it was a civil war too. 1/3 of the colonists supported independence, another third remained loyal to the British Crown, the rest undecided or just trying to survive. Families were torn apart, neighbors spied on one another, towns erupted in violence not from invading armies but from their own people. In New Jersey, A loyalist named Richard Stockton was dragged from his bed, jailed, and had his estate destroyed by Patriot forces. He was one of many. And let's not overlook the silent figures in the background. The women who managed farms, nursed soldiers, and smuggled messages sewn into the hems of skirts. Women like Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man to fight in the Continental Army. Or Phyllis Wheatley, the first published African-American poet, who wrote to George Washington and praised the cause of liberty, even though she remained enslaved herself. Her voice, soft but clear, echoes through the fog of that era. Even Native American tribes were pulled into the fray. Some allied with the British, hoping to halt westward expansion. Others tried to remain neutral, only to be drawn into the violence anyway. The Naida sided with the Americans, while the Mohawk joined the British. By the end, most native peoples were worse off, regardless of whom they supported. Their lands would be carved up in the new republic without apology. And through it all, myths blossomed. Not out of deception, but out of yearning, a desire to make sense of chaos, to find heroes in the confusion, to teach children that history has meaning. But it's worth remembering that legends are not always lies. They're just simplified truths. The real stories, the ones passed quietly between generations, are messier and far more revealing. There's a letter written by a Continental soldier named Joseph Plum Martin, describing a night march during the war. He said, "We were hungry, dirty, and cold, but we had hope." That's what so much of the revolution was, at its core. Hope. Hope not only for freedom, but for something better. Something still not yet fully realized. So as we close this journey together, from the cobbled streets of Boston to the muddy trenches of Yorktown, from whispered codes between spies to the flickering candlelight over parchment in Philadelphia, we remember that history is not just what happened. It's how we remember it, who we choose to honor, and what stories we choose to tell ourselves as we lie in the quiet, wondering where we came from and where we're going. Thank you for staying with me through this long and winding path. If you've been listening in the dark, perhaps with eyes closed, I hope the stories settled gently into your thoughts. If you've been driving or working, I hope it gave you something real to carry with you. Until our next late night story, sleep well, stay curious, and if you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing or leaving a gentle like. It helps more than you know. Good night. you